Hi, PreCalc. We're going to go ahead and get started in Chapter 5, and we're going to start off with Section 5.1, using fundamental identities. So the identities that we're going to be using are the same identities that you would have had in Lesson 4.3. And so some of this work is going to look pretty familiar. We're going to start off with opening up to page 348. The identities that are on page 348 are super important, and they're the ones that are going to carry you through the lesson. Now for the first example, they want you to find the values of the other trig functions if you know cosecant and that cosine is positive. The old way that we would have done this problem from chapter 4 is we would have sketched a right triangle where cosecant's negative. So by the way, we would know the sine is -3/5. So where the sine is negative and the cosine is positive. So that would be over here in the fourth quadrant. All right. And that tells us it's a 3, 4, 5 triangle. This is a side length of 4. From here, you would be able to find the rest of your trig values. What we're going to do in this lesson is we're actually going to use identities to help us. And so what I'm going to start off with, I know that sine is -3/5, and that's using a reciprocal identity. Now to get started on finding the rest of them, I'm going to go back to my Pythagorean identity. I'm going to plug in my sine. I'm going to solve for cosine of u. When I take the square root, I get a plus or minus 4/5. Now, what you want to watch out for on these is that you get the correct sign on what you're finding. We know that cosine is positive. We know by these clues that our answers are all coming from the fourth quadrant. And so if cosine is positive, then I, of course, will be taking the positive sign on my cosine. Now to get tangent, I can stack my my sine over my cosine. And then, of course, you would finish off the problem by finding the secant by flipping over your cosine, and your cotangent by flipping over your tangent. So what I want to see you do in this lesson is use identities to help you. Now, if you look at the directions in your textbook, it doesn't say to use identities, but that's the whole idea of this lesson, is to get you guys back into using identities. So I want you to try to switch over and use identities to help you find the trig values. Okay, moving on. The rest of this lesson is basically skill building. It's getting you ready to go into lessons 5.2 and 5.3 when we start working more with identities and proving identities. And actually in 5.3 you're going to be solving trig equations. So all of these skills are going to be crucial. The first thing we're going to do here is we're just going to try to simplify this. And you're going to look at this and say, well, I might flip that over and say that's 1 over sine, and this is cosine over sine. But something else you need to realize is that when you can factor, you need to try to factor. So we have cotangent that we can take out of both of these. And then if I go to page 348 and I look at my trig identities, I can see that cosecant squared minus 1 is cotangent squared. And if I multiply those together, I get cotangent cubed. Okay, so you guys are just going to have to recognize when you can factor. So in this case, we had a common factor of cotangent, factored it out, cleaned it up. Okay, now B doesn't say, or it doesn't look like a factoring problem. They don't right now have anything in common. So there you might want to try to write things in terms of sines and cosines and see where that gets you. So we know tangent is sine over cosine. What we're going to do next is we're going to multiply these together. And then we have to add these two fractions together. Our common denominator is going to be cosine. So for that to happen here, we need to multiply it by another cosine x over cosine x. And that takes me up here. Okay, now we have a common denominator of cosine x. We know sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. And 1 over cosine is secant. We're going to do the same thing on C, except we're not going to flip it to sines and cosines. When I see two fractions, I'm automatically going to try to write them with the common denominator. So my common denominator is going to be tangent times 1 plus secant of t. So secant of t is going to pick up 1 plus secant of t minus tangent of t is going to pick up another tangent of t. All right, and then I'm going to multiply that out. I'm not going to multiply out the bottom though. Rarely do I do that. So I'm going to keep my bottom factored. You'll see why in a minute. Okay, so I have distributed here. All right, secant squared minus tangent squared. And look back on page 348, and that's another variation of a Pythagorean identity. That becomes 1. So now I have secant t plus 1 over tangent t times 1 plus secant t. All right, these are exactly the same factor. So they're going to cancel out. And we get 1 over tangent t, which is cotangent t. What do you think? Big problem turned into something pretty small. All right. Again, you're going to be there are going to be problems that just say to factor, so we just need to make sure your factoring skills are up to par. So that's difference of 2 squares. So cosine x minus 1, cosine x plus 1. It just says to factor it, so that's all we need to do. Now on B, you're probably looking at that again saying, well, can't factor that. They don't have anything in common. Well, what you can do is take out secant squared, and that's 1 plus tangent squared. So that's a substitution. And then here's the rest of the problem. Now I'm just going to rewrite it. Oops. And then if I can factor x squared minus x minus 2 into x minus 2x plus 1, this will factor in a similar way. And we got it. All right. Moving on. This last one, for whatever reason, students find these difficult, and I don't know why. I think they're pretty straightforward, but again, for whatever reason, students tend to miss these a lot. So I'm going to give you steps on how to work with these. says you're going to use substitution, and x is this value. We're going to plug x right into that expression right there. So the first step is to substitute. Now you're squaring the whole quantity 3 sine of u. The next step is to simplify. So both the 3 and the sine get squared. Then we're going to factor. We're going to factor out the 9. Okay, and then we're going to substitute with an identity. 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. And then we simplify again. Okay, I'm going to show you one more of these on page 352. It's example 8. All right, x is 2 tangent theta, and I want to put it into 4 plus x squared. So substitute first. Simplify. Factor. Take out 1 plus tangent squared, and using my identities, I'm going to plug in secant squared. And then take the square root. And there it is. All right, that is the end of these notes. Take care, you guys. I miss you.